After 4 years of America First under President Donald Trump, the incoming Joe Biden administration is working to recommit to the spirit of global trade and cooperation with allied countries and trading partners around the world. But as the president-elect inherits an economy paralyzed by the COVID-19 pandemic, will he truly open up America for business, or will he retain some of the protectionist policies placed by Trump that do put America first, keeping production and jobs within the US? We discussed this today with Waqas Adamwala, the Economist Intelligence Unit's lead Asia analyst, who joins us from Singapore, and Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start with you, Mr. Adamwala. Now, let's start with the impact of Trump's America First policy on global trade deals and multilateral frameworks over the last 4 years. Do you think Joe Biden can repair the weakened trust in Washington's trade policy?
Unfortunately, it's going to be a very hard task for Biden to repair the trust that has, been destroyed or rather eroded over the past 4 years. Again, also the primary challenge for the Biden administration will be to address the domestic challenges at home, the economic crisis, coupled with the health crisis. So yes, while he has multiple issues on his agenda, domestic economy and the health crisis will take priority effectively. He has obviously got intentions to repair the multilateral deals that Trump pulled out of, whether it's just not just trade deals, but also, for instance, climate change issues. But again, the path getting back to track for the US under Biden administration will not be quick and immediate, unfortunately.
And Dr. Samuelson, Joe Biden's pledges to keep things made in all of America seem more or less the same with the intention of keeping Americans producing and consuming domestically. Do you think protectionism more or less will continue under the Biden government with new trade deals put on the back burner?
Well, like President Trump, it is a priority for President-elect Joseph Biden to think about employment, especially manufacturing employment in the United States. And like President Trump, President-elect Biden has a commitment to encourage employment in the United States. Both of them also see international trade as interacting with employment difficulties in the United States. However, we can expect their approaches to be very different. President Trump viewed tariffs as his primary means of dealing with other countries, and President Trump had an antipathy for multilateral agreements and a great preference for bilateral negotiations. President-elect Biden is different in both counts. He plans to return to multilateral cooperation, multilateral agreements, multilateral negotiations, and he places much less emphasis on tariffs than does President Trump. His Buy America program, one could reasonably refer to as protectionist. The United States already has a fair amount of Buy America rules, procedures, habits. President Biden will strengthen those, but this will have a much different impact than President Trump's tariffs. I expect it to have a less drastic impact on our international trade, and I expect it to be easier to move from an emphasis on America based on Buy America to more multilateral trust and cooperation than it would be from an era of tariffs.
Right, so we'll see less perhaps aggressive undertones in President-elect Biden's policies. And Dr. Samuelson, what do you think will happen to the tariffs on steel and aluminium that Trump placed under Section 232? Do you think Joe Biden will work to remove them? And also, do you think we should expect the decoupling of the US and Chinese economies to continue for the time being?
Well, on the tariffs, I wish I had a crystal ball. I suspect that Joseph Biden would be pleased for an opportunity to remove those tariffs. I say pleased for an opportunity because this is a delicate political matter as well as an economic one. It wouldn't surprise me if he would look for something that he can couple with the removal of the tariffs that will make it look like he has made progress in cooperation with other countries rather than simply a unilateral elimination of the tariffs. As for decoupling the countries, I wouldn't say that they've been decoupling. I would say that we have paused for a bit the pace of integration between the two countries. the world economy in general, the Chinese and the American economy are just of their own force of events going to become increasingly coupled with one another. This would have happened probably considerably more slowly under President Trump. I expect it to become a little less of an issue, and I expect that we will, with some time, with some work, with some trust building, see more interaction between these economies.
And what are your thoughts on this, Mr. Adamwala? Do you expect the decoupling of the G2 economies to continue? And also with Biden's plan to invest in massive infrastructure projects and a net zero economy, do you think America is going to provide any kind of opportunity or incentives for its allies?
Sure. I think I agree with Dr. Samuelson that yes, using the word decoupling might not be exactly true, but even in the Biden administration, the US is not going to go any easy on China. The sentiment amongst Americans is definitely quite sour against China, and yes, we expect Biden to continue on to that, whether it's human rights issues, property theft, or other issues like that. But moving on to your other part of the question about Biden trying to focus more on infrastructure, there are, for instance, certain gains for various allies in Asia Pacific, because when you talk about trade war, we often say that yes, there were disruptions. Countries which were export reliant, like Japan and South Korea, were impacted. But certain countries like Vietnam did benefit from that. If you do talk about specifically infrastructure, then countries like Australia, for instance, might benefit because they're a big producer of iron ore. They are basically the country that could benefit from China's investments in infrastructure. So if Biden pushes onto that path as well, possibly countries like Australia and other commodity producers might benefit from there too.
And Dr. Samuelson, now over the weekend, 15 Asian countries formed the world's largest trading bloc, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Do you think that this China-led deal is going to push the US towards rejoining the TPP or expanding its trade network at all?
Let me first pick up on something that I want to agree with. There is a good bit of just residual antipathy in the United States for China. Some of this was encouraged by our previous administration. It'll take some time to overcome that. But the emphasis on a multilateral approach to China, President-elect Biden's indication that he views the appropriate, the useful way to deal with China to be to enlist allies and deal with them collectively, that is already, I think, quite an encouraging step forward. The RCEP is a remarkable development. There's a sense in which it's just the inverse image of the original Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was viewed as having the United States at its center and involving a number of countries from the Pacific Rim, perhaps even viewed as an effort to isolate China. Now, instead of this, the RCEP has China, Japan, and many of the same countries, and it looks just like the opposite of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think that joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not likely to happen very soon. Attitudes towards trade agreements have been turned upside down in American politics in recent years. The Republican Party used to be enthusiastic about free trade and free trade agreements. The Democratic Party was the opposition, and yet it was to a large extent the Democratic Party that pushed the Trans-Pacific Partnership initially, and the Republican Party has been quite protectionist recently. So many of the existing rules have just been turned on their head. Biden has indicated that he plans to turn to multilateral agreements essentially after he's done a bit of getting our own house in order, after he has his investment in R&D and innovation in infrastructure going. And so we may see a return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I don't expect it quickly.
And what are your thoughts on this, Mr. Adamwala? Now, how important do you think trade networks like RCEP and TPP are going to be in restoring the global economy?
Again, it shows that Asia is going to be leading the world for at least the next few decades in that sense, because they are the ones driving multilateral deals. And yes, in effect, RCEP in the medium term or even short term rather, it won't have that much of an impact. But what it does is it sets the tone. For instance, Korea, Japan, and China were trying for a trilateral FTA. That again was disrupted due to bilateral issues between Japan and South Korea or other issues in general. At least with RCEP, they do have one another framework to actually encourage and improve the trade ties. Certain issues still remain because different countries have different formats of actually ensuring that the new tariffs regimes or rather reduced tariff regime comes in phases or rather immediately. Other countries also have bilateral issues. For instance, China and Australia have their own diplomatic disagreements, and yes, they're still both part of the RCEP. So it won't be as holistic as TPP is, but at least it's a step forward in the right direction.
Mr. Adewale, after the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the US economy was rather slow to recover, which the Obama administration was blamed for in a way. But then we saw China emerge from that crisis stronger. Do you think we're going to see the same kind of phenomenon this time around emerging from the coronavirus pandemic?
To be fair, we already are, because China's actually the only major economy in the world that is not contracting, whereas the US and most of the economies are going through a severe recession. So yes, China is slowed down, but it is not contracting. So its recovery next year is potentially going to be even faster. Its economic cloud is expanding. During the last global financial crisis, BRI, for instance, was not as major of a theme as it is now. So yes, China's economic expansion, China's trade policies or investment policies in general, definitely much more of a heavier cloud than they were back in the global financial crisis a decade ago.
And Dr. Samuelson, now, of course, Joe Biden plans to push through a massive COVID recovery plan through the government. But how feasible do you think it would be for him to actually push through the recovery stimulus if there is a divided government?
Unfortunately, the two sides to this negotiation apparently seem to be very far apart, and their positions seem to be hardening. One fears that the recent somewhat encouraging news about a vaccine may make it even more difficult to get a recovery stimulus package soon, because it may lessen the urgency that some people feel to get this stimulus package through. It's going to take some deft statesmanship and some compromise, some convincing to make this work. I am hopeful that this will happen, but I think we have to be realistically prepared for some continued deadlock.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we're going to have to end the discussion today. But that was Wakas Adewale, the Economist Intelligence Unit's lead Asia analyst, who joined us from Singapore, and Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University, joining us from New Haven. Thank you both so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you as always for watching.